Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Skylar. I am going to be MC today. I'm very excited. Um, HGP, we strongly believe in freedom of speech, but I'm going to state that the views expressed by myself, our reader this morning, and today's speaker, in the HGP members and our guests today, these are not the official views of the humanists of Greater Portland. Humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead meaningful and ethical lives. We use reason and empathy to guide our decisions and our actions. We live meaningful lives because we honor the fact that this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge that all that humans have accomplished in the arts, sciences, and humanities, but also simply the possibility of peace and well-beings, the well-being when people interact with respect for one another. So our reader this morning, we have him on Zoom, is Al Christians, and he will read for us when you're ready.
Okay, today we've got a reading from Berg and Evans, the book being The Natural History of Nonsense. Now, some of you may be kind of angry at the universe because the universe really doesn't care about us, but you got to give credit to a universe that allows life to arise totally unexpected by anyone. There was no expectation that life would show up here, but it did. And after roughly 4 billion years or something, what happens? But life writes a book about the natural history of nonsense. Now, you got to give credit to the universe for allowing that. And Bergen Evans, this book was written in 1946. He was famous. He grew to his highest achievements was he was the question writer for the $64,000 question. But he also was a master of ceremonies on a bunch of the early TV game shows in the early 1950s. And uh, one writer for the New Yorker said, "I take more pleasure in discussions scholarly if Bergen Evans didn't laugh so jollily." Which reminds me of my own saying I used to tell myself all the time that nothing worthwhile ever gets accomplished without having a little fun. And I don't tell myself that so much anymore. I'm not sure why, but let's get into this reading. To ascribe the increase in mental and nervous disorders to our inability to cope with contraptions is to evade a serious problem in a dangerous way. Neuroses, and as an aside, I'll mention that we don't hear much about neuroses anymore. I wonder what's gone wrong with them. Neuroses, which do seem to be increasing among us, result from frustrations rather than from complications, so that it is the emotional rather than the mechanical situation that calls for correction. Animals have been driven mad in laboratories, but not by being made to take unusual risks or by being compelled to operate complicated mechanisms. Their neuroses have been induced by training them to respond to certain signals and then switching the signals on them, so that when they did what they had been taught was right, they were punished instead of being rewarded. Mice and men are alike in this respect, and modern society sometimes looks as if it were deliberately designed by some fiendish experimenter in order to drive us insane. We are brought up to expect rewards for certain kinds of behavior and then thrown into a world in which none of the signals works. We are taught as children to be kind, self-sacrificing, and helpful, never to be greedy or aggressive. Then we meet, then we must live in a ruthlessly competitive economy. We are taught to be honest in preparation for a world in which honesty is often penalized and dishonesty in 1,000 forms is often rewarded. Our ambition is stimulated and we are assured of success if only we apply ourselves, when actually the very nature of things, 9 out of 10 must be disappointed. And chance carries as much weight as merit. The real result is mass frustration and despair. The only the stoical and the cynical can preserve a measure of stability. Yet stoicism is the wisdom of madness, and cynicism is the madness of wisdom. So none escapes.
That was great. Now I would like to introduce today's speaker. Her name is Barbara Hilyer. She is the author of Legacy Lost: Passing Across the Color Line. Um, I kind of got an opportunity to speak with her, and it kind of sounds like this kind of just started out as meeting family, and then kind of turned into a genealogy project, and then turned into a book. So that's kind of cool. That just how family relations can bring about her story and her experiences. It's just a testament of how individuals lived and thrived over centuries in America's race conscious society. So I will let you go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about finding out about your group. And I want to thank Beth Parmenter, who's a member of another group with me, who heard me talk and invited me. So it's a good example of how little things follow bigger tracks. I would like to start by just having you look at me and tell me what you think you see. Well, I say, what features, what judgments would you make about where I was from, or what race I was, or where my family was from?
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? I like that you're willing to say, because a lot of times people just get so uncomfortable they don't want to say anything, you know. But that's kind of funny that you would say Italian, because that's what my father used to tell us, that we were Mediterranean, but we didn't really know what that meant. But I think when people look at me, they see my hair that's frizzy and curly, and that's my natural hair, and they see my skin color. And I've recently spent 6 months in Hawaii because, as you'll learn, part of my story is based there, and I spend a significant amount of time there. But my skin color is dark anyway. And when I'm in Portland, which is primarily white, people see me as someone with a great suntan. When I'm in Hawaii, people don't see me as anything, because Hawaii is very mixed race. Hawaii County, where the Big Island is the most racially diverse county in the United States. And Multnomah is one of the least. So it depends. If I go down south, people think I'm black. If I'm here, people think I'm white with a good tan. So I'm going to launch in and tell you a little bit of my story and how I came to know my story, which I really didn't know. When I was a little kid, and I grew up in a white middle-class suburb of Bellevue, Washington. And when I was a little kid, I used to look at the lines on my hand, because the top of my hand was darker than the bottom of my hand, and there was a definite line. And I remember looking at that and going, well, that's weird. Why is that? But I never thought anything about it. It's just, you're a kid and you ponder and you wonder, and that was that. Well, my dad died when I was about 24 years old. And I had been close with my dad. My parents had been divorced, but I had a close relationship with my dad and with my whole family. And about 10 years after he died, I learned that he had a sister who lived in Hawaii. And I actually kind of knew that when he died, because that's a different story. I'll go into that later. I kind of knew he had a sister, but I also knew that it was just a door we didn't want to go through. That was not something we needed to do, because the other part of this story that weaves through is there's some mental illness in my family. My grandmother was mentally ill, and my father had always told us, the reason you don't know your grandmother is because she's crazy and she'll think you're trying to kill her. So we were like, whoa, okay, you're a kid, you hear that, like, okay, we don't want to know grandma. So when we knew he had a sister, we were kind of like, well, I don't think we want to know her. That's just kind of the way you compartmentalize things. But 10 years after he died, my stepmother told me that he did have a sister who was in Hawaii and that she had met her. And then she told me that she was African American. She said, because your dad's family was African American. And I was, what? Okay. This was like 1988, I think. And I was a teacher at that time. And of course, I just said, well, I have to go meet her. So my stepmom made contact and found her, and we went to Hilo, Hawaii, and met her. And she was the age that I am now. I'm now 70. And I don't know how well you'll be able to see this. Well, I guess you will a little bit if I show. And I can pass these around when I'm done with them. This is a picture of my aunt and me when I first met her. So she was 70. I was 33. I was there to just say, what's this family? What's this story? And she was very open. She was I want to just highlight about her because I don't want to tell you my whole story or you won't read my book. But that's not her. This is her, the first one with there you go, that one. There you go. Yeah, perfect. Good tech help there. So my aunt was a very amazing person. And in the book, I say that she had this special laugh that I call a parrot shriek guffaw. She laughed like this. And I kind of laughed like that too. So we immediately bonded over many things. She had been a teacher. She was very political. She read a lot. She liked to swim. She was super active. And she was very smart, ethical, and outspoken. And I've since that time, just this last year, have written a book about her called Helene Hale, Leading with Aloha, because she served in Hawaiian politics for 26 years in elected offices over a 50-year period. She was elected to the State House of Representatives as the oldest person elected at 82 years old. And that was because she went looking for a woman to run for office to represent her district, and she couldn't find somebody. So she said, well, damn it, I'll do it myself at 82. So I got a chance to campaign with her and be with her and really learn a lot and come to appreciate her. But her story, she was born in Minneapolis along with my dad. And then she graduated from high school and went looking for work in the late 1930s. And for an African-American woman to try to find professional work on the mainland United States in the late 1930s, it was just impossible. And so she traveled all over the country looking for work, couldn't find it, and went down south and taught in a black school and went to New York and just tried these various things. By that time she was married and she had a daughter, and she decided to move to Hawaii because it was so multiracial. And she wanted to raise her kids in a multiracial culture. So she moved there and became a teacher. But in 1955, she got elected to the County Board of Supervisors. Hawaii wasn't a state then, it was a territory. So she was the first woman elected to a Board of Supervisors in the state. And then she ended up serving on that Board of Supervisors and eventually becoming what would now be the mayor. Then it was called the chairman. And I'd just like to read a little. I have a few excerpts to read to you. Her first term on the Board of Supervisors began in 1955, the year I was born in Seattle, to a brother she had not seen or spoken to in more than 15 years. Her son, William, was born the following year. She served on the Board of Supervisors from 1955 until 1963, administering through the transition from territory to statehood. She was then elected chairman, the modern equivalent of mayor, and served in that capacity until 1965. Her photo on the cover of Ebony magazine noted she was the first woman to serve in an executive position in Hawaii's government since Queen Liliuokalani. And I don't have a copy of that picture because it's still under copyright and they wanted $2,500 to use it. But if you Google Helene Hale Ebony Magazine 1963, it pops right up. During this time on the mainland, American society was embroiled in numerous racial issues, integrating schools as a result of Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, the Montgomery bus boycott in 55, the Civil Rights Act in 64, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and nationwide race riots in 1965. This was not a place that offered opportunities for a Negro woman to participate in decision and policy making. Her elected positions in Hawaii offered her full participation in the political process. And as I said, she went on to serve in and out of government over a period of 50 years. And which is why she's so ethical and so strongly steeped in, she would have been a great humanist, so strongly steeped in the concepts of peace and equality that I thought that her words needed to be shared. And I was a high school social studies teacher. So I wrote this book for social studies students as a way of understanding your government and understanding ethical leadership and how you could participate. And I have a couple of quotes that really stuck out to me that she gave to graduating classes in the early 60s, which are still just as applicable. She said, "As you pursue health and happiness for yourselves, you will soon learn that you do not live in a vacuum or alone. As health and happiness are available for others, so you will get your share. As the world becomes a better place for all people, so it will be better for you." So she has this timeless kind of wisdom that we are sorely lacking at this historical moment. So that was meeting her. And I got to know her and be with her more than I was with my dad, because I got to be with her over a period of 25 years. And ironically and poignantly, I was with her when she died because both of her children predeceased her. So there was kind of a good, coming together where I could bring her something that she didn't have. So what I learned from her was she was trying to leave history behind. She was just trying to make her mark as a woman and as a Black person, and both of that was very hard in those time periods. In the 40s, in the 50s, that was not easy. And so she didn't know a lot about her family, but she knew enough to give me little kernels to be able to go and do more research. And that was, I didn't start out to write a book. I just started out because I was curious, like, okay, that's who these people were. What were the people they came from like? So her father was Gail Pillsbury Hilyer, and you'll be able to do this. That's this man. And he had been raised in Washington, D.C. in a very prominent, aristocratic African-American family. And he then went to the University of Minnesota, like his father had, and became a lawyer in Minneapolis, and was the first head of the NAACP in Minneapolis. He practiced in a white law firm. And he then ended up living the end of his life in Hawaii with his daughter, and he's buried there. Now, he died when I was 22, so I could have met him, but I never did. I was never allowed to. And when I asked Helene about that, she said, well, you didn't have to be around Daddy very long to know he wasn't all that white. So that's why, from my dad's perspective, we couldn't meet his parents, because then we would know. So he, I'll just move on and go back and talk about him a little more. I want to talk about his name, because his name was Gail Pillsbury, not a common name. And when we were kids, the only thing we knew about Pillsbury, being raised in Seattle, was the little Pillsbury Doughboy, and we used to always tease him about that. But my dad was like, he didn't go there. But so his dad was Andrew Hilyer. And Andrew Hilyer had been born a slave in Georgia. He had escaped out of Georgia after the Civil War due to he had a grandfather who was involved in the Underground Railroad. So and after the war, he got out and eventually ended up in Minneapolis. And Minneapolis at that time was an accepting place. And the Gale family and the Pillsbury family clearly must have helped him because he named his son Gale Pillsbury Hilyer. And then my father was Gale Pillsbury Hilyer Jr. So it clearly is a case of philanthropists who helped this young man, but I can't tell you who or exactly how. I would love to know that, but it's a little too far away to know exactly how that happened. But he was definitely kind of a, you know, a favorite son of Minneapolis, and he came back often, was written up in the press in Minneapolis. Andrew went on, after being the first Black graduate of the public high school in Minneapolis and being the first Black graduate of the University of Minnesota, he went back to Washington, D.C., where he worked in the federal government. And the federal government's always been a more, not always, but at certain periods of time, the federal government has been an open place for Black people to work. It isn't now, mind you. So he became a lawyer and an accountant. He was an inventor. He was a writer. He was a speaker. He collaborated with Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, who are kind of the two most common names that we all know out of African American history, because Washington thought that the slaves should work and gain financial independence and prove themselves to the white world, whereas W.E.B. Du Bois thought they should get educated and compete more quickly. So there were kind of these two things. And Andrew Hilyer thought they should do both. He thought that yes, they should get educated, and yes, they should own businesses, and yes, they should go to and purchase from businesses. So they should promote Black businesses. And that's what he was known for. He published a directory of Black businesses, pardon me, so that people would know where the businesses were that they should put their money behind. He shared a debate stage with Frederick Douglass, who would have been a generation older than he. And he wrote prolifically and spoke prolifically. So there's a couple of his speeches that I just pulled out excerpts from. Again, poignant to the times. There will be from time to time sharp revivals of color prejudice. He wrote this in 1892. The presence of these two different races on the same soil certainly presents one of the most interesting problems the world has ever seen. Being thrown upon the body politic as we were in ignorance and poverty, the wonder is that we have fared as well as we have. The white people have had for many years the start of us in this race of life. We proclaim it to be a great wrong for any white person to manifest prejudice against us as a class. It is equally wrong for us to hold prejudice against white people as a class. We ask to be treated as any other people are treated, as individuals, not as a class. I hate prejudice, prejudging without inquiry or examination. I have devoted much time to it as a study of mental phenomenon. I think I know something about its nature. But I stand up before you here tonight and declare that I have completely purged my heart of prejudice. I do not hate white people. I do not hate any class of people. I love every soul that God has made. But I love my own people, my own class more, my own family most. I am moved to say what I say by love and not by hate. By love for the class of people with whom I am identified, not by hatred against any other class. Prejudice is based on selfishness and feeds on differences. And lastly, these are from different areas, different papers. The white American is a great traveler. He is also a color prejudice missionary wherever he goes. So he was this kind of bigger than life person. And once I got into learning how to research African Americans, I found a lot about him. But I didn't realize when I started out that you can't go to white newspapers of the time because they didn't report on Black people. So you had to go find Black newspapers in order to find what they were reporting on Black people, because white people didn't value it. We're probably going to go back to that now. One other thing I found more recently, this was published in 1892 in the Minneapolis Daily Times. Andrew F. Hilyer, a colored graduate of the high schools of Minneapolis, will deliver a lecture this evening in Washington on an analysis of American color prejudice and how to overcome it. Andrew got his start in life in Minneapolis by shining them up morning and evening, thereby making a living while attending school. The shoe shine boy. Later, he became a barber and eventually owned not less than 3 shops in that city. All this time, sticking to school himself and supporting a younger sister, whom he also educated. When Andrew finally graduated, he was greeted by such an ovation as has rarely, if ever, been accorded any graduate in that city. For years, he has held a position in the third auditor's office at Washington through the friendship of Senator Washburn of Minnesota. In the meantime, he has amassed quite a snug little fortune, which is represented in real estate in Minneapolis. Andrew Hilyer, the once little street urchin, is an example of the self-made man that the boys of today would do well to take pattern after. So he was kind of a rags to riches tale. And again, people always wonder when they look at pictures, they say, well, that doesn't look very Black. Or people used to say to me, like, how Black are you? And it just shows how people don't really get it. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to look a certain way. You were judged to be that way, and you were called that way, and you were treated that way. But it was interesting when I went on one of my research trips, I went back to Washington, D.C., and I went to Howard University, which is a premier historically black college. And I went to their archives and I walked down the stairs and his picture was on the wall. And I was kind of like, wow. And I went in and I asked the woman there, who was a Black woman, who was the librarian. And I said, I'm looking for blah, 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 blah about Andrew Hilyer. And he's my great grandfather. And she said, wow, of course we know who he was. He served on the board of trustees of Howard for about 15 years, among other things that he did. And his house, there's a plaque on a heritage trail about him, so he's well known back there. And the one librarian who was younger meaning about my age at the time, looked at me and said, how did it feel to be raised as a white woman? And I was kind of like, well, I don't know. How's it feel to do anything? It was kind of, there were 2 different Black women who asked me that. How did it feel to be raised as a white woman? I don't know. Anyway, I developed a pretty extensive bibliography about him because I always thought I might write something on him, because he deserves to have one of those little biographies like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and all of that. However, I don't know that I'll live long enough to do that, but I put it all in a bibliography in case somebody else does. So they mentioned in this newspaper article about his sister that he also helped his sister. And I started to do research on her, and women are always harder to research than men because they're even less valued, and Black women are even harder to research because they're less valued. But I was very surprised because I found a college building in Florida that was named the Foote Hilyer Building. So the woman I'm going to talk about now is this woman, Jenny Hilyer, and this is her with a group of nurses at Freedman's Hospital, which was the big Black hospital after the Civil War in Washington, D.C. And this is the building. And so it was called the Foote Hilyer Building, but I just bypassed that. I was like, that didn't mean anything to me. And then once I started to look more into her, I realized that the building was named after her. So I kind of skipped something, and I want to go back and read this first. So I'm doing this research. I'm doing a lot of it online. I went to Washington, D.C. I don't know much about the South. I've never been there. I've always kind of dissed it. I never really like, oh, I don't want to go there. I knew enough about what had happened there. So I'm learning as I go along. But also when I went to Washington, D.C., I met this cousin who's Black, whose name is Skip. And he had kind of talked to me about things. And so, never knowing any other Hilyers growing up, I had no idea that Hilyer was a not uncommon surname in the South. Early on, I found a Hilyer contact online in a southern state and asked the gentleman if he might have more information about the Hilyers I was looking for. I should note that he was white. He emailed me back to say that his daughter, Missy, had extensive information, and when I contacted her, she answered me right away. I explained that I was likely looking for a white Hilyer family near Monroe, Georgia, who would have had a Black connection with Andrew Hilyer. I never heard another word from her. And I later realized that I had done the unthinkable. I had crossed the color line to be direct about race in the South. Skip admonished me later, Barbara, don't go knocking on doors of white people in the South to ask them if they had Black relatives. I was new to this and I had a lot to learn. It seemed the same to me as knocking on Black doors, which had opened up to me. But as I now know, Black people are all too familiar with the concept of passing and wouldn't be too surprised to have relatives appear out of nowhere. Many whites, on the other hand, had built walls around their whiteness. They had a lot more to lose or to risk. So given that, I wanted to just say that about a little my experiences in dabbling into the South. But Jenny Hilyer was a really interesting woman, I think, in the mold of my Aunt Helene. She also was born into slavery, went to Minnesota, was obviously mentored by the Gales or the Pillsburys of whomever, because her boat lifted, she got educated, and they were in this kind of aristocratic Black society in Minneapolis and in Washington. But at that time, there was a real clarion call for Black people to go out and help lift the race. Like that was spoken everywhere, like come join the call, kind of like the civil rights movement, in our era, go down and help, go do this. So Jenny joined that movement because she went down to what was then called Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University School for Negroes. It's now called FAMU. And she became the head of nursing down there, the superintendent of the hospital, which was the only hospital that served Black people in that area. And then she also lived there. These were, self-sufficient farms and self-sustaining educational institutions. So she lived there, worked there, and from about 1902 till about when she retired in 1925. So when I found that picture online, it just kind of clicked, but not totally. So I'll tell you a little more of how that came about. I found Dr. Nathaniel Wesley's book, Black Hospitals in America, History, Contributions, and Demise. He was kind enough to respond to an email query, and in a subsequent phone call, he directed me to the Meek-Eaton Black Archives at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University. The director, Dr. Merle Dawson, enthusiastically encouraged me to pursue the career accomplishments of Nurse Hilyer and come to Tallahassee to see for myself. I had never traveled to the Deep South, but I knew I had to visit. It was readily apparent that Dr. Dawson was a beloved figure on campus. We bonded immediately over our love of education and history. Walking across the campus, she interacted with many students, offering up hugs, encouragement, or a gentle chiding to study for the next test. The words of wisdom she shared that day have stuck with me. Students come to me and they tell me they have a problem, she declared in her warm Southern speech. I asked them, is anybody dead? Because if nobody's dead, you don't have a problem, you've got a situation. And a situation you can deal with if you have a plan. Now, is anybody dead? So I like that now. It's a good contextual thing for our problems. Anybody, Dad? So that building was named, the building is now an administrative building on the campus, but it was named after her and the doctor who replaced her. Dr. Foote came after her, but it's called the Foote Hilyer building. And it was just quite amazing to think this woman had a building named after her in the South. Now, all this research came about from my brother, who went back to Washington, D.C. soon after we knew about Helene. And he did a little research. He went to Howard University and he went to the archives. He did all this before I got more into it. And he took a picture of the gravestone of Andrew Hilyer and Jenny Hilyer and Mamie, who was Andrew's wife. So it was this little bit of documentation that led me to go to find, what I could find. So, and this is Mamie. This is Andrew's wife. Now, this is a totally different piece of Black history, because I was telling you about Andrew and Jenny, who came out of the South. They came out of Georgia after the Civil War. They had been slaves. They had lived in the South. But Mamie was not. Mamie, her family was free. And I found her relations in this District of Columbia Free Negro Registry. So some people after the Civil War went around, took all the documents from people so that they could say, yes, I swear that I was born free. And those documents exist, in libraries and archives. So her family had owned property throughout the Civil War, paid taxes, had businesses. They had been free actually back to the time of George Washington. And she was a powerful woman. She traveled in Europe by herself, which imagine, that at the turn of the century, that just wasn't really done. She was a musician. She was a piano teacher and a soprano. She belonged in a lot of community groups, again, trying to lift the race. The idea was that if you could demonstrate culture and that Black people appreciated culture, and she had started a chorus called the Samuel Coleridge Taylor Chorus that had 2,000 voices in it. And Samuel Coleridge Taylor, not Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was a poet that you might know, but this guy was an African British composer who was the most popular man of his era. Like before Martin Luther King Jr., he was the thing to look for because he was accomplished. He was appreciated around the world for his choral music. So she was integral in meeting him in Europe and bringing him to the United States to perform and to establishing this 2,000 voice chorus of Black people who could perform. Anyway, that's Mamie. And I thought also very interesting, she controlled all her own property. She left her property in a will of her own. She died before Andrew. And so did her mother and her grandmother. And that was, again, just unheard of in that time, that women would control their own property. But they did. Then the ironic thing that came out of this was I could trace this all the way back to Mount Vernon. But I was on a website, and I'd put my DNA on a website, and somebody contacted me, this guy, Black guy, and he said, I think you're related to my mother. And I said, okay. And he said, I think you should join this group that's forming called the Descendants of the Enslaved of Mount Vernon. And I said, well, that's kind of a bit of a leap, but I'll think about it. I said, I won't do it if I'm not positive, because sometimes in genealogy, you have a hunch, like you think this, but you can't prove it. And I come from like 4 generations of lawyers, like, yeah, I got to prove it. And so I said, well, I think I have the documents that would say, yes, Mamie's family came from this William Costin of Mount Vernon, but I'm not 100% sure. And he said, well, if you join the group, you get an hour with a genealogist from Mount Vernon, and then you can find out. So I said, okay, fine, I'll join the group. So I got on my 1 hour call, and within 10 minutes, she said, yes, yeah, this is right. You have your lineage right. And I said, okay. And so I decided to join them. And the reason I've joined them is because the work they're doing is really great. We don't hear about it out here because we don't live where all the old plantations and historical sites are, like Monticello and Mount Vernon, and there's a lot of them back there. And those stories were always just telling how great the white people were who owned those places, and they never told the story of the people who did all the work and the people who made it happen. Well, these people now in various monuments are trying to get the story of the people who lived and worked there told. So that's why I joined them and I meet with them, because I think it's great work that they're doing. And it's all the more important because we're not going to be able to hear those stories nationally or in schools for a while because of our political situation. So monuments and museums and small groups are going to have to carry on the stories until they get back into the mainstream. Okay, I should ask, what time do you want me to wrap up? Okay, perfect. Okay, so then I've told you a little bit about the Hilyers who came out of Georgia, and the Costans, who were free, wealthy people throughout early 1800s and into the 1900s. And now there's a different thread. There's my crazy grandma. So we go back to my crazy grandma, and I say crazy with a little bit of trepidation because I know it's very PC, and I am very empathic about mental illness because I have two siblings who are mentally ill, and I lived with that with my family. But when we were kids, that's what we called her. So I'm just hearkening back and using the words. That's what we called her. She was crazy grandma. So her family, who I was hesitant to go look into, is the family of my cousin Skip, the guy I met in Washington, D.C. So once I met him, I said, Skip, how many people in that family were really crazy? And he said, just your grandmother. And I said, okay. Then I wanted to know, because my grandmother's younger sister, Ruth Bunch, had married Ralph Bunch. If you know history, he was a Nobel Prize winner. He negotiated the first Israel-Palestine peace accords, and he was an undersecretary general of the UN. He was probably the most famous Black man of the 50s and 60s. And so he was an uncle, a great uncle of mine. Well, my grandmother's family came from Alabama, and that's a very different story. And that's my whole point of my story and history, is that race plays out very differently in different localities and in different time periods. So you can't say that there's an African-American experience in America. It depended on where it was and what time period it was. So my grandmother was very, very light-skinned. She could easily pass as white, and did when it was necessary. Like even when she was married to my grandfather and they were prominent African-Americans, if they were going to go buy a house or go to the bank, she'd go in and do it, and she'd leave him in the car. So they would use it fluidly, because some people passed permanently, like my dad did, permanent, no contact with his family, didn't tell anybody, permanent. And some people did it situationally. So her family was an interesting family because they had a lot of white men in it for obvious reasons. So her father was African American, and he was a legislator during Reconstruction in Alabama. Reconstruction, lasted about 12 years. Black people served in offices. They did some great things, but they were all portrayed as being buffoons and not doing any good. And then we went backwards when Reconstruction ended, and we know where that went. So, but he had been African American. However, her grandfather was white and her great grandfather was white. I want to talk about her grandmother because I think she's the most interesting enigma, I would say. This woman here, yeah. who looks very European, if you ask me. If I saw a picture of her, I would think she was European. However, she was born into slavery, and if your mother was enslaved, then you were considered a slave. There was no negotiating about it. So her name was Josephine Hassel. Her father was a wealthy white planter, Benjamin Hassel. And her husband, not husband, because she was never married, but she had 10 children with another wealthy white planter. Now that man did support all of his kids, and all those kids did go to colleges. So it's not black and white. You can't say, oh, he was a slaveholder and he raped her, and you can't say that. You have to look at the nuances of how that played out. And a really primary document that I found that really was helpful was the WPA, the Works Progress Association, was a federal program during the Depression, and they hired people to go out and interview the last living slaves. So they're called the slave narratives, and you can find them online. Well, one of her daughters, who would have been like my great great aunt, was interviewed. So she explained how all this happened, saying, our father was a planter and he did right by us, but they weren't married. And he did, that man, I can't think of his name now, Samuel Hardaway, had a white family, a whole white family. So when I went back to Alabama and I went to the cemetery, here's Samuel Hardaway with all of his white family is all buried there. Then there's Charles Oscar Harris, the black man who served in the Reconstruction Legislature. He's all by himself. His family was all gone. And the reason his family was all gone was, again, another key point in history, which I'll tell you in a minute, because I went to the Alabama archives and I met with these historians. And one of the things I said was, how did this happen? And they said the Klan. In the 1920s, the Klan was resurgent. So all these kids went away to colleges, came back, would have come back, but by 1925, they were all gone. They all left. So back to her story. She was an enigma because she had been born a slave. In 1840, there was a special law, a special legislative act written so that she and her sisters could stay in the state after they were freed. Because otherwise, if you were freed, you had to leave the state. You couldn't be freed and then stay there. So this special legislative law was written so that she could stay. So she obviously had influence and power and authority. It turns out she also owned slaves herself. Because like I say, things aren't black and white, right? She was wealthy. She owned slaves herself, and she was a Confederate. So when I got to that, I'm just like, no, you can't be a Confederate. Yeah, you can. So again, when I was talking to those archivists, I asked them how could that be? How could this woman who is African American live right in the heart of the Confederacy, live her life, have kids that were not all white? How could that work? And he said, and I love this, Barbara, the rules never hold for people at the top. And look at right now, you don't have to abide by those rules. If you're wealthy and you have influence and you have power, then those rules don't really apply to you. So there's one other on that trip to Alabama. When I went to Washington, D.C., and I met this cousin Skip, he told me, you need to go to Alabama to find out about your grandmother's family. So that's what I was telling you about. So I did on a visit to Montgomery, where I met this Black historian, who was only a few years younger than me. And he grew up in Alabama, not knowing any white people. Similarly, across the country, I had grown up in the Pacific Northwest, not knowing any Black people. He gave me honest answers to my very Pacific Northwest, i.e. white, questions about race in the South, and provided a context for the lives of my relatives in Alabama. After this initial meeting, Dr. Bailey kindly toured us around Montgomery, noting the places significant to the modern civil rights movement. He was knowledgeable and talkative and shared his own story. When I was in high school, I wanted to get a job delivering newspapers, which I did. I also decided that I wanted to go on to college. I asked the white woman who had given me the job at the paper for a letter of recommendation. And Barbara, she looked at me like I'd shot Jefferson Davis. So that kind of context then of what life was like in Alabama for those people, again, depending on the time period, and that put together with what it was like for people who came out of the South, who were helped, and the people who were free on their own, abilities from the start, starts to make how complicated the story is. And I would say that now, in kind of wrapping it up, we really have to look at where we're at now, because history has lurched back and forth. As W.E.B. Du Bois said, the Negro had a great moment in the sun. What did he say? He said, the slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again towards slavery. And that's where we're at now, because we had this, time period where Andrew and his sister and Charles Harris all had opportunity. The doors were opening. They were going towards something that was going to be inclusive of them. And then it went back. And you had my dad and my aunt who were trying to make their lives prior to the civil rights movement, prior to Martin Luther King, in that era, and they couldn't do it. So they made two totally different choices. My aunt chose to go to Hawaii, and my dad chose to live in Seattle and raise us as white. Then you had the civil rights era, and we went ahead. And we had, Martin Luther King, and we made some movement. And now you have now. And now we're going back. We're going to have a conscious effort to undo that progress. And then we don't know, what will happen next. That's really what's out there. What happens next? Who gets to tell the story? But doors of opportunity open for certain people in certain times and places, and they're closed for certain people in certain times and places. So people have asked me before, like, how do you feel about your dad? And having made that decision to pass. And I just say, everybody makes decisions based on what they want their life to be at the time. And I'm sure it was a very, very hard decision. My dad was depressed most of his life, and my dad committed suicide. So I'm sure it wasn't easy. But I also know, it makes me teary, that he did it for us. He did it because he wanted me to be able to go to college and sit here and do this. So it's a hard, thing to go back and look at why people did certain things at certain times and places. And that's my story.
Wow. So much. so much. You had a lot. You did the work to figure this out. That's amazing.
It worked well because I was a history teacher, and I had always been interested in it. And that's why I could parallel it, because I knew what was going on at those times. So I think that really helped.
So amazing. Okay, well, let's start with question number 1.
Thank you. That was just wonderful.
Thank you.
Our daughter joined us through adoption, and she is of mixed race. When we're filling out the form, you just check, and we were open to race. Her name is Katie. Her last name is Christians. She's fair complected, and she speaks like I do. Yet she struggles. So can you give us some how these folks like you that have, you've been raised white and yet you found all this history emotionally, how do you handle it? That I might share that with my daughter.
When you say she struggles, what do you mean?
she lives in Portland. She's black. She's black. She tells us she accepted that as a child, middle school. I'm black. And yet I laughed because when I look at you, I saw white from the beginning. When other people, you say when you go south, they see black.
That's what our lens does, right? That's what our brain lens does. And I would say, one thing I would say to her is, you have to have a comeback to people when they make statements, because you have to say something like, you're making an assumption. And I say that, people will stop me, and I use lots of examples in the book and say, oh, you have such a great tan. And it used to just irritate me when people would say that, because tan is like a status symbol if you're white. But if you're too tan, then you can be othered, And so I started saying, well, I'm not that white. Like, I just had to have some quick answer that I could say. And I would feel for her, because if she identifies as black and that is her and she feels that, then, and being here in Portland where people are going to assume she's white, I would say, depending on how outspoken she is, she needs to have a response that, what does she say?
And then they'd like, what's the story? You're black and your old white parents are white. And she'd say, my dad doesn't know my mom had an affair. Oh, that's brilliant. Brilliant.
That's so funny.
Yes. But they would just wait for it because they just loved when she'd say that.
Yes, I love that. And how old is she?
She's 36 now, and doing very well. But
that is, and among black people who are very light skinned, they all struggle with that, because in the white world, people want to say, where's the black person? Like, that's what people would say. Who's black in your family? Well, they're all really light skinned. You can't go back, I suppose you could if you went back 400 years or something, but that's not the way it plays out. And so that's a white person's misconception. And in the black world, they know that everything could be any color. Someone could look white to black. And my cousin Skip, who's about the same color I am, he was a lawyer and in Washington, D.C., and some official asked a friend of his to bring in an African-American lawyer to serve on some committee. So Skip went in, and the guy told his friend, I thought I told you I wanted an African-American guy. And here's Skip standing there going, I am. So it's that piece of, and that's why maybe black isn't a good term. And things have certainly changed now in America, because we do have a lot of, immigrants who are African and not from the African-American experience. But I would say that I feel it. I feel her. That is difficult. And she needs to put people in her place, and she needs to use it as a learning opportunity, and good for her. Good for her. Tell her I'm out there doing the same thing. Like, don't make us, and I tell people too, don't make assumptions. Don't look at people and make assumptions. But I'll tell you a great book. It's called Passing Strange. And it's about Clarence King, who was the first head of the USGS. So this is like turn of the century, 1900s. He's a very wealthy, aristocratic white guy, and he passes as a black guy, but he's white. He has a black wife down in, I don't know if they're married, but let's say a black family down in the South. He goes out all the time to travel because he works for the USGS and they're surveying at that time. So he leaves Washington, D.C. and his wealthy mom and his aristocratic friends, and he's dining with the high, mucky mucks in Washington, D.C. He goes out, but he really then goes to be with his wife and kids who are black. But they think he's a Pullman car porter, because when he leaves them, he tells them he's going to work on the railroad, because a lot of black people worked as Pullman car porters. So it's a wonderful story. And I won't tell you how it ends, other than to say that woman who had his kid was told that she'd be taken care of by him after he died. And so after he died, she came out and sued the and I won't And I won't tell you how it ends up because it's all a really good story. But that just shows you in the Black world, you could be white and convince, and people would not, okay, you were really, really white. Yeah, interesting.
Gail said, I've had people my entire life ask me, what are you? And she replies, I'm American.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. Good.
And so,
first of all, I appreciate your whole life story and your intellect and your candid presentation of stuff that often isn't discussed openly. My personal story, and there's a question buried in this story, is I am Sephardic. Sephardic is the Jewish people who left Spain during the Inquisition, who chose not to become Catholics. And they traveled anywhere across Europe, and they landed wherever they felt was safe. My mother comes from Salonika, Greece. My father comes from Constantinople, Turkey. My wife's parents come from Romania and Hungary. We were looked upon as the dark Jews. We didn't have blonde, blue-eyed people in our group. Occasionally, but very, very rare. And I got my first taste of that distinction. I said, what do you mean? And then when I went into my field, I'm a retired pathologist, all we're doing is talking about degrees of melanin in the skin cells. That's what we're talking about. Because if you went to the autopsy room and had 10 bodies opened up, no facial features, and you were looking at kidneys and lungs and liver, things that you may want to use for transplant, I defy you to distinguish the black from the white. You will fail every time, and you do. Because once you open up, that difference in melanin is gone. So having experienced it at a personal level, my closest friend, German Jew, blonde, blue-eyed, mother always told me I was too dark, and as a young man. And I didn't know what that meant. But over time, I got the sense of what it meant. And it gave me an insight into that distinction, which is false and artificial. So do you have to have an experience to really know what it is to make those distinctions that are so artificial?
oh, I think that was the question. Do you have to have an experience to make distinctions?
I guess that is, I would throw that question to somebody who knows more about psychology and human behavior and that. I think your story shows again how the view of race depends on locality and time.
Yes.
The experience that you have. So your lens was different from other people's lenses. And now that we're a much more mobile society, we're seeing more of that. Because it used to be people were in the area where they were born and they didn't see anything that other people around them didn't see, and now they do. But I don't know. I think that's a really good question that I will ponder, because maybe you do have to. And maybe that's why we're in the moment that we're in, where we're so factionalized, where certain people have not had that experience and therefore they live in a different reality. I don't know.
A bliss ignorance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let's go to number 2 here at Friendly.
Hi, Barbara. That was great. I really appreciated that. And I have to say, I loved Helen's comment that her daughter made it humorous.
Yeah.
You know, that way you can diffuse the situation. You can tell people about things, but not in your face.
Yeah.
You know, it was very nice to do it that way. I wanted to know about your aunt, the one in Hawaii. How did she decide? That was the thing for her to do. You know, that was How did she
How
decide
did she
that?
decide to be black?
No, yeah. To move to the, to move to Hawaii.
Yeah.
What was her, do you have any,
Why did she decide to move to Hawaii?
Why did she decide to break on the racial line of being African American and not white? Because she was as light as my dad. She could have.
sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
She had a slightly different experience than my dad because they were both raised in Minneapolis when their father was doing quite well financially. And Helene was 5 years older than my dad. And they lived in a big house and they lived in a white neighborhood, but they socialized with black people and professional black people. She went to a school where the kids were all white and she played with those kids. However, the family came upon hard times in the Depression and they had to move to a different house they had that was a rental house that was in a black neighborhood. My dad had to change schools and my dad had that experience. He went to a segregated black school. So they partially, the economics of the times changed such that they had different experiences. And then she went to college at the University of Minnesota. So she was already allied with her African American family because her dad and her grandfather had gone there. Whereas my dad was younger, my dad left, and then the World War II started. He joined the Merchant Marines, and he just signed up and said he was Irish or American and just stopped saying what he was. Then he went to a different law school in Illinois, and then he moved out to Seattle in 1950, which was worlds away, at that time. Yeah, and very white, and then she went into the University of Minnesota and went looking for jobs, but identified as an African American woman. Then her first job she got was at Tennessee Agricultural and Mechanical University, another historically black college. And then when she was there, she married the college president's son. And so he was strongly identified as African American. So then the two of them traveled around the country looking for work, and they couldn't find good work. I mean, they did work in some things. They worked like for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. They worked for the March on Washington, not the one in '63, but there was a March on Washington in the 40s to try to desegregate the military. And so if they worked in civil rights things, then they could work as black. But if they tried passing as white, they got jobs, but they didn't like it because they couldn't be who they were. And then if they were black, they couldn't get good jobs. He had a master's degree from Columbia and she had a master's degree from the University of Minnesota, and he was hired to sweep the runways, So it came down to opportunity. So for them, by that time, they were firmly identified as black, and she got a job teaching at San Diego State University. And when she was there, there was a poet named Don Blanding, who was a famous poet who wrote about the tropics at that time period. He published drawings and cartoons in the Honolulu Advertiser, and he loved Polynesia. So he came as a guest speaker to her class, and she heard about a poem, and she said, "That's where we want to go," and they left.
Barbara, thank you. Interesting, and more importantly, which thought-provoking, insightful stuff shared. So thank you. My question: you mentioned somewhere along the way people deliberately trying to make sure that they got their registration paper, that they were born free. Okay, and I'm just curious, kind of a historical context. I presume that only mattered pre-Civil War, that post-Civil War, I wouldn't think that mattered, but I wanted to ask in case you could shed any light on what historical context that concern and deliberate effort was put in to say, hey, born free.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
You're tapping into my historical brain, and I hope I'm kind of a generalist, but what I would think is even after, before the Civil War, yes, you had to prove things. You had to prove your papers and where you were from, and you weren't free to travel. And so if you were, in fact, the relative that had been in Mount Vernon, he challenged a court case in the early 1820s because there was a new law passed that said you had to prove where you were from. And he said, that shouldn't apply to me if I've always been from here. So these were people who were always, pushing against it. But after the Civil War, all I would say is it's not like one magic slate got wiped everything clean, right? It's not, there was still status, based on who you were. But whether they could prove they were free or not, good point. I can't answer without doing some research, but I would guess one thing is, what if they wanted to claim property that had been taken away or whatever? So I would think legally, and I'll think about it. If you give me an email, I'll get back to you about it, because that's kind of interesting. I can't, because these were sworn out like in the 1820s, 30s, 40s. That good question. I don't know enough to be able to answer.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Time permits later, I'd like to throw in a thought on the question of, do we have to experience this kind of stuff? But that's
Okay.
Let's get all done.
Let's go to number 4 here at Friendly House.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful. I believe in the South, they used to have laws about what percentage Black you had to be in order to be counted Black. I think it was 1/32 or something. Yes. Now, if we go back far enough in time, of course, the entire human race came out of Africa. Yeah. I mean, the entire human race is African. Yeah. I mean, there was a migration. There was interbreeding with Neanderthals. So I have some Neanderthal DNA. Native Africans do not. So what does this concept of race mean when, if you go back far enough, we're all African?
Right. Right.
Well, it's all a social construct, right? Just like the guy on the Zoom was saying, if you cut everybody open, everybody's just the same. So it's the melanin in your skin, but it works as a social organizing structure to maintain power over people. And, any way that look at what's happening in Sudan, or look all around the world where people take other people that don't look like them and use some reason to make sure that they can keep power over them. And that it worked. And you're right, now it works less and less, because as we go farther and farther away, people are less and less. But how much does that mean? I would have enough racial blood that, had this been pre-Civil War, that I would fall to those, to those laws, or not even Civil War. I mean, all the way up to just being in the South. Yeah, I can't answer it again. That's a bigger psychological, who we are as humans kind of question.
Okay. And Hank online, go ahead with your question.
A wonderfully interesting program to begin with. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, so in the vernacular of my youth, I will say that it's clear that you're a damn troublemaker.
True.
In particular, I'm interested in the side of the equation that you lean on when it comes to locality and time regarding the so-called Black experience. Have you had much pushback about the more centrality kind of idea of, well, there is a unitary Black experience, and when you push on locality and time, you're somehow a damn troublemaker?
I like that. And I'm going to be a damn troublemaker. That's good. That's a good concept, because I've kind of only developed this idea of locality and time as I've given more talks, to try to make it make more sense to people so that they can follow these broad, kind of things. Because I think that we have so oversimplified the history in America that people just think, well, there's Black people and they went to Black schools, and there's white people and they did this, and the Blacks were poor and the whites had the money. And so I wanted to try try to say that was not true. Andrew Hilyer was a wealthy man. They were aristocratic. They were upper crust. And I don't think people think of that in their stereotypes of Black people, or think of Black women who owned property and controlled their own assets and traveled by themselves. Or so I think it's to get out of that. Black people were poor and white people were this, or the idea that every plantation owner raped the women, and that's how the kids were made. And I just think it's, of course, that's some of the story. All of those have pieces of the story. But I just think that all of history, we tend to be too, we want it to be simple, and it's not simple. History is not simple. It's based on people, and you have to know the background in that area. And bless you if you're from Texas, because I've always had a deep-seated prejudice against the South and Texas. But I'm working on it. I have to admit, those are my prejudices. So I won't come be a troublemaker.
Well, Hank,
I don't live there now.
Hank, as a former Texan myself, I like the way that you say time, because that's how it's supposed to be pronounced.
Time. I like that too. Time and locality.
And so question number 5 at Friendly House.
I appreciate what you were just saying, that you can't assume that everybody in a certain group has the same attitude. But you use the terms Black world and white world. That could be interpreted as you're suggesting that all whites have the same attitude and all Black and so forth. So I kind of object to those terms. Maybe there was a Black world and a white world back in the Southeast during the slavery era, but not now. And what now rules everybody, and I hope everybody, what MLK Goodner said: don't judge a person by the color of their skin, but by the content of his character. So you have a response to my.
Well, I would say that helped. That helped a lot. And we made a lot of progress. But clearly, not everybody thinks that. Clearly, we're in a rise of white supremacy and a resurgence of power over people based on the color of their skin. So I think to say that there still is a clear experience that you're going to have as a Black person versus a white person in this country. There's a very definite experience. I would share an experience of a woman that is a good friend of mine who's Black, who lives in Portland. She's a professional woman. She's well dressed and presents herself well, and is all over town on boards and all of this. And she walked out of the Safeway down on 10th Street with a cart, a shopping cart, because she goes to wherever and does her grocery shopping. And a man approached her as though she were homeless. Now, that was because she was Black, I'm quite sure. And she felt quite sure that that was why. Why would he ask me, do I need help? And she laughed and said, I'm towing a Whole Foods cart, for crying out loud. But I think you are treated differently based on what your color is. I do think. Now, I do think that we've made great strides, and I think affirmative action allowed for a lot more people to rise up, and we have more people in positions of power. But look at the statistics in the corporate world. Look at the statistics in the Senate, in the House. Look at where the power is. So I still think that it's a predominant white view, and we just have to work to see it differently.
And I think currently last question, number 6, go ahead.
Feel when you first found out about your heritage?
That's a common question. And I laugh because I called my brother to tell him, and he was running for political office up in Seattle, and he was right in the middle of a campaign. And he said, Barbara, this is a terrible time. I am not going to win any votes with this. I'm not.
Damn troublemaker.
And he said, I really am all for you going and finding out. You do whatever you want and then let me know. And after the election, I want to know. But and he did, and then he went and met my aunt, and they were peas in a pod because they were both, political kind of people. So because I had been raised in a very tolerant family, I didn't have anything I had to overcome. Like, I can imagine for some people it might have been startling depending on how you were raised. But my parents had been divorced, and my mom married a Jewish man, and we lived, another just slight story. We, in the mid 60s, my mom and my stepfather sold the family house that my dad and my mom had lived in a white suburb in Bellevue. And we had been in that neighborhood for 10 years, good friends with all the people, all, friendly family. And that neighborhood turned on us because my parents sold the house to a black Boeing engineer and his white wife and their mixed race kids. And those people who my mom thought were her friends, who she had coffee with for 10 years, and we had snowball fights, and it was a neighborhood, but that was 1966, and that was not taken well. So I had a few little experiences, and my parents were very tolerant. So I would say it just made me very curious. It made me very curious.
Okay. There was one last comment from Dr. Amanda Feller online. One applicable lesson I heard from you about our current political climate is for small groups to keep the records, make stories, and have evidence of marginalization. So yeah,
that is so true. It's going to be small people, small groups. And, throughout history, that's the way it's been. Small groups carry the story when the overall story isn't allowed to be told. So absolutely.
Did you want to give your comment, and then we can move on to announcements?
The gentleman's question was, do we have to have personal experiences to wake us up to some stuff? And I would just throw out the example that you're all very familiar with. Dick Cheney was a hardcore conservative on everything but what?
Gender.
Same-sex marriage. Why? Because
of his daughter. Yeah.
So the short answer to that is apparently yes. We have to have these personal wake ups, but we don't get it. My challenge to us, I think, in a group like this, without breaking our arms, patting ourselves on the back, one of the traits of being a genuine progressive is that I can care about issues when it actually doesn't affect me. I can invest in that. So the challenge is to say, no, I won't fall for that natural human tendency that, it has to affect me for me to wake up to it.
Good point.
Our second challenge is to figure out ways of slowly waking up our fellow citizens.
Yes.
To say, come on, you can't really have to do the Dick Cheney thing.
Yeah.
You ought to be able to get past that and beyond that.
Yeah.
So thank you for letting me throw that out.
That's a really good point.
And that you helped me answer your question, which is some people do have to, some people don't. Some people have more empathy, more whatever, they're just differently wired and they can pick it up. But some people do. And the question is, like what you said, the challenge.
And yeah, thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.